Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Fred Mijang, and I'm a member of the board of the American Insurance Trust, known most simply to you as the Trust. We're delighted that you're able to join us today for the kickoff of the brand new second half of our series, We Hold These Truths, Perspectives on Health Disparities, Racial Identities, and Cultural Humility. Now a little bit about myself. In addition to being a trustee, I'm a distinguished service professor, director of the Graduate Mental Health Counseling Program, and interim undergraduate psychology chair at SUNY Westbury. I'm also a former president of the National Latinx Psychological Association and the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards. I'm a former chair of the American Psychological Association Ethics Committee and New York State Board for Psychology. It is our honor to make a land acknowledgement. Indigenous communities have lived in and moved through places in which we all sit over hundreds of generations. And indigenous peoples from many nations live and work in these regions today. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of those communities and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Today's webinar, Pathways Forward, EMPAs Speak to BIPOC Resilience, Collaboration, and Solidarity, is being presented by Drs. Helen Su, Theopia Jackson, Aisha Ikisler, Andrea Romero, and Iva Graywolf. I wanted to tell you what makes these women experts in their field. Dr. Helen Su is a past president of the Asian American Psychological Association and an advisory board member of the JED Foundation. She is lead clinician for outreach services and liaison to the Asian American Activity Center and lecturer at Stanford University. Dr. Su is a consultant and presenter nationwide on topics addressing youth and young adult mental health and culturally responsive interventions. Dr. Theopia Jackson is the 2019 to 2021 president of the Association for Black Psychologists. She's a licensed clinical psychologist who received her master's degree in clinical psych from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and her doctorate from the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. She has held several leadership positions in higher ed and is currently chair of the clinical psych program at Seabrook University. Dr. Jackson is a co-founder for the Therapist in Residency program, which is an African-centered program dedicated to supervising Black clinicians in training and providing services grounded in Black psychology for persons of African ancestry. Dr. Aisha Ikisler currently serves as the president of the American, Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African Psychological Association and is an assistant professor of psychology at St. Mary's College in Maryland, a public liberal arts college. Her research focuses on the link between oppressive experiences and mental health outcomes amongst marginalized groups with a special interest in Arab MENA Americans, LGBTQ+ individuals, and intersectional identity development. Dr. Andrea Romero is past president of the National Latinx Psychological Association. She is vice provost for faculty affairs at the University of Arizona, where she is the lead administrator on faculty matters related to professional development, career advancement, a professor of family studies and human development in the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, and a faculty affiliate in psychology, Mexican American studies, gender and women's studies, Latin American studies, and public health. Dr. Iva Graywolf is a licensed clinical psychologist and president of the Society of Indian Psychologists. She's an enrolled member of the Fort Peck Assiniboine tribe and on the ancillary rolls of the La Corte Ore, Ojibwe, and Ishibwe tribe. Dr. Graywolf has over 40 years of experience delivering behavioral health services primarily to Native people in rural and remote areas. She's committed to serving the underserved. Dr. Graywolf managed a multi-site behavioral health outpatient program for many years in Southeast Alaska. She's a trainer consultant nationally and internationally on a variety of behavioral health issues such as complex trauma, co-occurring disorders, grief, clinical supervision, and resilience. We are very fortunate to have them all with us today. Here are our learning objectives. Define the intergroup diversity and range of issues that each EMPA represents. Identify the impact of racism encountered by the EMPA communities. Describe activities of solidarity and support implied by the EMPAs to foster resilience, collaboration, and equity for their members, communities, and the field of psychology. This webinar will discuss activities, strategies, and programs that the Ethnic Minority Psychological Associations, or EMPAs, have developed to provide support and build resiliency, awareness, and solidarity amongst its members and communities to combat the effects of historical and systemic racism and discrimination. To accomplish this, first, each EMPA will discuss its mission and describe the communities it represents. Then we'll discuss the historical and current challenges each is addressing. And lastly, we'll discuss strategies and activities and programs each is used to provide support and build solidarity and resilience within their communities, and also in improving our field. I'd like to welcome all of our guests. The slide on the screen now shows some of the literature, longstanding literature in the various fields that we are going to be discussing. So welcome, everybody. Why don't we begin by sharing your the association mission and the populations that you're presenting. So why don't we start with Andrea?
Thank you, Dr. Mian. And I'm really honored to be here with all my colleagues today. So happy to have an opportunity to share with you about the National Latinx Psychological Association, or NLPA. We've actually been around slightly over 40 years when a group came together at a very small conference in a rural area in California. And then we've gone through different stages of being very active or not active, came together very strongly again about 20 years ago, and have just really developed and grown. Started again with just a small group of us meeting in a side room at one of the larger conferences and saying, gosh, we really need this, you know, because this context of, this, this white, patriarchal, heterosexist, capitalist society around us that was pervading everything, in our experience, not only in society, but in our training in psychology and in our experiences in trying to publish and, practice and, become, part of higher education, that we just really needed to come together. And it was so restorative when we did. We've grown dramatically since that time. We've moved from doing conferences every other year to doing conferences every year. Almost approximately 40% of our members are now students. So it's so exciting to see this big, we say onda, like this wave of students that's coming through with a critical mass. And it's really, pushing the envelope and changing not only higher ed and the training in psychology, but also pushing our organization in really kind of fascinating and exciting ways as we are, moving into the future. I wanted to mention, we changed our name. Actually, I think when Dr. Fred Mian was president, we had a real push from within our organization to change our name to be Latinx instead of Latina, Latino. And so that was something that really, brought forward these concerns about representation of our LGBTQ community within our association, the need for representation and gender inclusivity. And if it's okay, I'll put a link in the chat where you can read one of our professional publications that talks a bit more about the X and why we created that, why that was so important within our members. Our focus really is to generate, promote, and advance Latinx psychology in the United States and globally. To do that not only in terms of science, but also psychological practice, education, and training, so that we really build knowledge, foster research, and promote culturally centered delivery of services to everyone that's out there. So I love that we started with our warrior scholars who have been publishing and sharing, the real root and center of our work in Latinx psychology that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years to some of our indigenous populations throughout the Americas that have been doing things like talk therapy in central Mexico. So that kind of work, the work of George I. Sanchez, who wrote and critiqued IQ testing in the 1940s and 50s, the work of Latina feminists, along with many of the other feminists in the other groups that are going to speak today who are talking about intersectionality for so long, and the importance of, what that means, and that it needs to be forefront in how we think and work in these areas of psychology, and also identified some of the very recent work by Adames and Chavez, who are really kind of pushing the forefront when we're thinking about what's going on with our Latinx communities today. So I'll stop there and pass the baton to whoever's next.
Thank you. Aisha?
Always takes me a second to find that unmute button. So as Dr. Romero just stated, I'm really honored to be here amongst colleagues as well today. I'm here representing the American Arab, Middle Eastern, North African Psychological Association. And so we're the sort of newest EMPA on the scene. And so for our history, our organization's history is much shorter than what's going to be described from the other organizations. So we were officially founded as an independent organization just in 2017, but we've been seeing ourselves pop up in the literature sort of intermittently for the past, I would say, 25 years. But a major impetus, I think, that led to our founding, unfortunately, was the publication of the Hoffman Report, which revealed just how specifically our communities have been disproportionately harmed by mainstream thinking and even within professional psychology in the United States. Before that, I really need to give credit to the sort of four mothers that came before me, Doctors Mona Amer and Gigi Awad. They were really critical to the fact that we could be founded as an organization, because what really helped is that they had been quietly sort of collecting names and email addresses of MENA psychologists over the years leading up to our founding in 2017. So I certainly wouldn't be here without them. They have a handbook on Arab American psychology that was also on the Scholar Warrior slide that you just saw. And so for our organization, we're in a unique position in that we are quite new, but it's also a very exciting time for Amina Sai because more than half of our members are students. Even over half of our executive board is comprised of students and ECPs. And I think there are actually systematic reasons for why that is. So it is both exciting looking ahead to the generations coming, but it's also a result of the fact that we haven't had research mentors and clinical mentorship by folks who have been able to have been focused on MENA issues. And so we see that changing now, and that's really exciting. We'll talk later too about different activities that we're involved with, and really I have to credit our student committee for the majority of that work. And so generally our mission is to enhance the professional development of the American Arab MENA psychological workforce, as well as to promote the well-being of Arab MENA communities in North America through multiple domains, so research, education, advocacy, and the advancement of ethical practice, which is particularly important to us. I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot. I mean, you're hearing the trends of the future as the increasing number of students of color are coming through the pipeline. So Ethiopia, Dr. Jackson, would you go next, please?
Absolutely. Thank you for this moment. And it is always a pleasure to be among the people, particularly my scholar colleagues on this call, the feminine energy. And Fred, you are phenomenal as you sit strongly among us in that strength-based place. So I am honored to be representing the Association of Black Psychologists, which is in fact the first ethnic psychological association to emerge. It has always been and continues to be independent of APA. We were founded in 1968 and came out of a time of civil rights when you think about our history and what was happening at that particular time, and the need for Black professionals to reclaim and define who we are, and more specifically, recognizing that the practice that we're in, the science, the psychology that we were part of, also played a role in the problem. And I can't tell a story without saying that I want to lift up our professionals and graduate students who boldly interrupted and tried to bring this critical conversation to the floor for APA during one of its conventions in San Francisco, and yet it was shot down. So this group walked away from APA and birthed the Association of Black Psychologists, and then from there, birthed the psychologies, the Black psychologies that exist for us. So our mission is very clear. It is the psychological liberation of the African mind. It is the illumination of the African spirit, and is the empowerment of the African character. So let me say too, this is not to the exclusion of anyone. It is to the specific centering and inclusion of who we're trying to work with. So our association exists for the people. It is service, our psychology, our science belongs to the communities from which we were born from and belongs to us as well. We have maintained the internal structure of the role of our graduate students with our professionals. We do have a student circle leadership base that works alongside us, as well as having their own specific projects. Our board, of course, runs us as a nonprofit, but more specifically, we've also adopted other African traditions within the center of who we are in terms of having a past president's council, a council of elders, and we also have our own ethics that are grounded in African-centered approaches. I want to close by saying too, as I mentioned this, to put it in more context, the unsung scholar warriors who birthed us and who birthed Black psychology made an intentional sacrifice, because at that time it was not popular. So many of them sacrificed their professional space because you're not going to be tenured studying Black psychology, right? These types of things, so I can't move further without honoring them. Also, many of us who are here today are here because of the leadership of ABSI, like our past president, Robert Williams, who transitioned, who during his presidency wrote a 10-point plan that he sent out to all graduate schools about what to do in order to promote and bring forward Black psychologists. So many of us owe our existence to the doors that these scholar warriors began to pound on and push to have open, and are still pounding today. And so I accept that legacy. And in naming many of them too, when we look at what's happened around the Larry P. case in California, where Dr. Williams and others played a crucial role in showing how the educational testing was disenfranchisement for Black communities, Black people. It was doing us a harm, not good. Issues of the Brown versus the Board of Education, the work of Drs. Clark and Clark. Many of these are those warriors who boldly put forth statements and ideas that dominant psychology was not ready to embrace and adhere. And I look forward to talking more about how this continues in our work and where we are today in this space. So thank you.
Thank you. Iva, will you introduce us to SIP?
Hao mitagu yapi. Dayawa chimnaga. Chazemi tawa tanaji miha. Mia Nakota Wia. And what I simply said is, hello, relatives. I'm happy to see all of you today. And my name is Woman Strong in Spirit. That is what the Nakota or Assiniboine people call me. And I am also honored to be among such powerful colleagues. And I really appreciate the positive energy that is here today. We started out much like the Latinx Psychological Association, small. And we had and have had our conferences in Utah for a number of years, like over 30 years, with Horse Camp and with our always having a spiritual elder to guide us, to present to us, oftentimes most times having a sweat lodge available to our members. And so the culture is intertwined with our gathering together. So we have a very diverse group in similar to the other organizations. There are over 574 federally recognized tribal entities and 63 state recognized tribal entities. And we have a lot of members that are from mixed heritage. So we have our primary goal is to advocate for the well-being of Native people through awareness and education of issues impacting their mental health. We support members through their educational journeys and through their work journeys as well. And this is a very key, important part because we are such a small organization and we need to nurture the generations, and we need to support the ones that are out there doing the frontline work as clinicians. So we part of this is to share information within our communities to have better outcomes, to better serve our people. And so that's just a little bit about us. We have been around for over 30 years, and we can't separate out the cultural presence, the cultural ceremony, along with the other parts of our convention. So we always have a retreat so we can get together, we can bond and support one another, and then go on to our convention. So very diverse group. We have a lot of mixed heritage. We have a lot of, many people don't know that because of federal relocation policies, we have a number of our population, 78%, according to the latest census, that are in urban areas. And the remaining 22% are in reservation or village communities. And so very different orientations as we come together. So I'm very happy to be here and I honor my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Helen, do you want to introduce us to AAPA?
Good afternoon, everyone, and wonderful to be in this rejuvenating space with my colleagues, my family here in psychology. I'm the past president of the Asian American Psychological Association. I just found out yesterday, president-elect for Division 45 in APA. And the mission of AAPA is very simple, just to advance the mental health and well-being of Asian American communities. And that's through research, professional practice, education, and policy. Education's huge, like most of the other EMPAs. Our largest membership is students. So sort of our rising scholars and leaders to meet the needs. And it's Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. So I've been doing a lot of talks about who that community even is. That Asia is 50 countries, many religions and languages. Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians are a whole other peoples with much more in common in many ways to indigenous peoples, includes Micronesia, Polynesia, Melanesia. And so it's sometimes a challenge trying to serve all the needs of our communities. We do have multiple divisions of membership within AAPA, which is also part of how people find places to work on projects of particular relevance and value. Our very first division was a division on women. We have a sizable division on students, division on South Asians, so our DESI community, an LGBTQ division. Two of our newest are, we have a division on Filipino Americans, division on practice. We were founded by scholars, Gerald Wing Sue and Stanley Sue, and most of our early presidents were. And we've also grown to try to link scholarship with community more as the decades have come by. And newest division is DOMA, so mixed ancestry, multiple heritage, and adopted Asians, because these are also sizable parts of our community with their own sort of psychological needs and interests. We publish the Asian American Journal of Psychology and have an annual conference, which will be going on our second Zoom year now. But a lot of what we're trying to address is how do we help psychology actually meet the needs of our communities, and how do we right now especially work to do work that is anti-racist, right? That a lot of us as therapists know we're trying to do trauma-informed work, but you can't be trauma-informed if you're not anti-racist, because you're replicating in our research and our work harmful practices. And so how do we really integrate that in our ethics and our training? And we're also serving to provide the mentorship, the intergenerational mentorship for most of our students who do not have any kind of legacy or connection or tie. And I think all the EMPAs really are trying to provide that kind of structure, the academic family, as well as the supports. And I'll just end there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the goal of this workshop was really to talk about all of the positive energy, the good works that these associations have endeavored through historically and through these recent times of extreme stress and turmoil. So we wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what some of those challenges have been, just to kind of flag them before we move into kind of how we've addressed them and how we've worked to overcome and build resiliency and solidarity between groups. Okay, so why don't we begin with Ethiopia?
Thank you, Fred. And just one point of quick correction. I'm actually the chair for the clinical psychology program at Saybrook University. I think he said Seabrook, and my apologies.
My
That was the area on my part. I also want to clarify who we represent. So the Association of Black Psychologists is actually international. So we have members across the globe, the Pan-African wisdoms that we're trying to step into, as well as having members who are not professionals or psychologists, but they are centered on the focus of Black psychology, if you will. And like several of our sister programs here, we do have the Journal of Black Psychology, as well as a deep, long-standing literature that's grounded in Black psychology, and there's actually 4 different schools within there. And I would invite the audience to go to our website to learn more about those different schools. But to your point, in terms of some of the things that we're challenged with and kind of moving through, the first and foremost is, in fact, the realities of why we exist. There is undeniably a long-standing history in America for this idea of the myth or lie of Black inferiority and the lie of white superiority. So there's this constant messaging that to be Black, there's something wrong with you. And psychology played a good role in that. Some unintentionally, and some were very clear about this. So what we've been dealing with is, first and foremost, trying to reclaim and rescue a science that was denied to us, particularly those of us who are direct descendants of those who were first trafficked here in 1619, when that 400-year period was simply erasing complete identity. And so having to recapture, reclaim, and recognize who we are. Baba Joseph White said the first time he saw a Black psychologist when he looked in the mirror. And the second piece here too is that it makes us foreign to ourselves. So we have another challenge we have is that many good intended Black psychologists do not recognize Black psychology, does not recognize the association of Black psychology, because they're still buying into the storiedness that kind of Blackness is something wrong with it. It's too African, if you will. So this is that internalized racism that we deal with collectively and individual within the professional stance. And then, of course, there is the power dynamics of the discourse within the field of psychology as to what gets taught. If you look at the history and systems courses, that's all about the forces in psychology. It's not about the social context and situations in which these psychologists are born. And so therefore there's not space or room or intention to talk about ethnic psychological wisdom like Black psychology. So these are some of the challenges we continue to contend with, and yet we persevere on. And our power has in fact been in the village, the collectiveness, because even though there are 4 different schools, they're not like in psychology, we talk about the forces, where they really are sort of pitting one against the other and trying to be the quote top dog. In our African centeredness of Black psychology, these 4 different schools of scholars are all talking among themselves. They're going for the same thing, but just starting at different vantage points. So there's more of a village cohesiveness in critical conversations and respecting those different stances than in our Western psychology, if you will. So these are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of just within the field. But of course, it manifests itself within our communities because of the damage that can be done. So with good intentions, Black scholars can be set up to do more damage in their own communities because they're not aware. They haven't been able to critically look at the limitations of Western psychology and how to build upon whatever some of the forward steps that have come out of Western psychology have also not been the most popular, if you will. So I'll add more, but I just want to stop there for this moment. But thank you for that
Thank you,
space.
thank you. Iva, would you like to follow up?
I'm using a new computer, so I have to figure out my scrolling thing here. We face similar challenges. The Western trained psychologists that have never had the opportunity to learn about Native ways of knowing. Our relatives across the border in Canada talk in their psychological association, talk about learning the two-eyed seeing, of taking what we have learned in the Western training that we've had, and also honoring the indigenous knowledge and ways of doing things with the people they're serving. So it's keeping both in mind. And I think that's extremely important. We have such diversity. Because of that diversity, we also see that naturally sorting out, whether it's a church or a family or an organization. Human beings tend to do this sorting kind of thing. And this colorism is still alive. And that is something that we want to address head on, that we have to extend that value in those old ways of saying, even the way we talk about that's our relative from across the mountain, that's still our relative. We are still part of the same family. And to hold that present instead of getting into this, who is more Indian? Who is the real Indian? And we will not ignore that. And I think that is tied to our strength, is that we don't ignore the challenge. And I think that's incredibly important. The I'm trying to look at this. There is a mindset in the traditional way of resolving conflict, is that you look for how do you restore harmony. And a very Western perspective, we have this mindset of there's a winner and a loser. And that is one of the key differences that we look at. How do we go about this? We also have that, we have to decolonize this timeline that we operate on, of wanting to have things resolved by a certain date without paying close attention to the relationship and the time that it takes to explore these issues, to give voice to all of the parties that are involved. And so we have that the variation in how do we approach talking, how do we approach listening. And these are time consuming in our communities because we have marginalized people that need to have voice. If they don't have voice, they become resistant. And it takes strength to be there to listen, to acknowledge another point of view. And so that's I think one of our greatest challenges is we have people that have learned about their culture. This is where we need to know our history. People who have learned about their culture from a book that they've read. They didn't get it in our curriculum, in our US curriculum. They didn't get the truth. It's very biased, oftentimes excluding. And I see even today where there's the efforts to erase the history because it's not, it makes people feel less American or less patriotic. And I'm going, whoa, how do you get better if you ignore? How do you get better if you will not acknowledge what we've done? And then how do you resolve where do we go from here? And so we have many of the similar kinds of dynamics going on within our groups. And for me, that history is an incredibly important part, to acknowledge the truth, and then we can move forward. So I will add more, but I want to pass the torch to another.
Thank you, thank you. Aisha?
Yeah, thanks, Fred. So earlier I realized I failed to sort of define the population of Arab MENA. And when I say MENA, that stands for Middle Eastern and North African. So the population of Arab MENA when I introduced my organization earlier, but actually identity and recognition is a notable challenge and context for understanding what our group is currently going through. So it's a good segue into the question of what challenges we're facing. So I'm hearing, many of my colleagues here on the panel referring to the problematic nature of Western views of psychology and understandings of mental health. And I do believe that we experience that too. However, and this actually connects closely, I think, with what Dr. Graywolf just mentioned about needing time to connect with one another. So I'm really eager, for example, to see more paradigms of Arab MENA psychology emerge. But first, we need to find each other. And we've struggled to find each other to start. That's a process that we're currently undergoing and have been for the past few years. And then it takes time to connect and grow with one another. And so, and I think that's particularly important for a group that is very collectivistic, that's community centered, that relies heavily on understanding family as extended family, neighbors. When I visit home, folks connect with neighbors regularly with impromptu visits over tea. That's how they resolve community concerns. So we need time. And so for us too, I guess, to go back to the definition, which I again forgot about. So when I say Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African, that includes the Arab countries such as, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, but also non-Middle Eastern countries like Iran and Turkey, and North African countries like Algeria, Egypt, Libya. And so we're representing a really diverse group of folks too, some that are Arabic speaking, some that are not. And we all look very different. We can't really be identifiable by skin color or other phenotypical characteristics. We represent various religious backgrounds. I think a common stereotype in the US is that Arab and Middle Eastern people are all Muslims, and that's not true. That also means that we don't all dress the same. So there are challenges to being able to find and locate each other in very realistic ways, at conferences and things like that. Some of us have talked about profiling each other by name and then trying to find each other at conferences that way. But that's obviously less than ideal as well. All in all, though, there's also the structure of how we think about racial and ethnic categories in the United States. So MENA, for example, was supposed to be on the 2020 US Census as a checkbox, but it was stalled and halted, so that change wasn't made. And therefore, what happens is that we once again are unrecognized. We can't collect data on our populations in order to know what kinds of disparities we might be experiencing. And so we have a lot of challenges related to recognition and identity. And then the challenge I spoke of before with, not being able to have had mentorship really up until now, in systematic ways. And I'm really hopeful that a group like Amina Sai can help with that. If folks have questions actually about demographic data collection, we have some details about that on our website at aminasai.org/wearemina. So I encourage folks to look at that. I feel like I've digressed, so let me pass the torch as well.
Thank you. Helen?
Great. There's so much to cover. So thank you. I will say one of the challenges that's top of my mind right now is as we think about systemic determinants of health, right? That physical and mental, especially in this time of COVID, that we've already got research and articles out addressing what feels like a double pandemic, especially targeting AAPIs or those who are thought to be phenotype AAPI. But that There's also clear data about the number of excess deaths. So API data, for example, has an infographic that does show pretty much all the ethnic minority psych populations have suffered excess deaths of 20% and up in our communities. So there has been grievous loss right now with great consequences in terms of trauma and grieving, and really just showing the holes in our safety net of healthcare. And it's more than 30% of excess deaths for AAPIs, including, just the different within group things like for Filipino heritage healthcare workers. So many of them, for reasons of imperialism and colonialism, have become healthcare workers, have come to the US to work, that we've actually had more deaths of Filipino heritage health workers in the United States than they have in the Philippines, right? And very significant patterns like that about where we sit in a society really determines our health here. We struggle with our own internal issues too, that a lot of our home countries have also practiced imperialism. We've been at war with each other in the past. We have very unhealthy things like casteism. And it's sort of as an association, how do we balance the psychology knowledge, the part that's good? How do we go toward health, maximizing health and safety without losing the values that we do have about community healing, mind-body healing, which is ancient wisdom far before Western psychology as a science was born. So toggling between these points is sort of part of our challenge while we deal with our own internal diversity. And the fact that in the field here, there's still just so little. Like I've been giving a lot of trainings on API mental health this month, and I always start out with asking people, how much API specific training did any of us get in our professional training or CEs, honestly? And usually the honest answer is none, or 1 day or 2 hours of a multicultural series. We're about 6, now almost 7% of the US population. The NIH funding we have for research on our needs, and this is including API and HPI, was 0.17%. So there's a reason you may not know much, that none of us know much about the needs in our community. So these are things we're grappling with. And the most frequent microaggressions are the perpetual foreigner, right? Having 6th-generation Americans being told to go back where you're coming from, that kind of effect on mental health, and the model minority myth, which is where I'll kind of end because that'll tie more toward what we talk about later. The model minority myth, which completely invisibilizes huge swaths of our communities and very much has been used by white academic culture, popular culture, to divide us against particularly our Black and Brown community members, and is not based on fact. And so we'll get into that later. This real resistance to looking at facts, that there's not a single place I've gone to talk about API hate right now where someone has not said, well, it's mostly Black people doing that. And I said, actually the data do not support that. The media might, the data do not. And how these things impact our relations too with our community and our ability to work together, I think is significant, and we'll talk about next.
Thanks, Ellen. Andrea?
I want to start by expressing my gratitude to my amazing colleagues for everything that they just said, because it completely resonates with me. And I think what also we have seen within our Latinx communities and within our psychological association. So having said that, I want to go back more than 500 years when I think about historical challenges, because the Mexica people in central Mexico were doing talk therapy and substance use prevention. So this is part of who we are as indigenous people in the Latin America areas, and part of what's been there for so many of us for so long. And also I want to acknowledge that some of the earliest psychiatric hospitals that were using humanistic practices were in Spain and Puerto Rico. And these were at times in history when in Europe they were still chaining people up. So some of those roots of our communities have been lost over time. because the stories have been suppressed, because they haven't been taught in the schools. So sometimes we don't even know that. And then there are these assumptions that, oh, there's stigmas, or that's not part of your culture, or things like that. When you really go back and you learn more of the history, psychology has been there for us, and part of how we heal and how we understand ourselves and our community for a very long time. I appreciate that so many people mentioned this Eurocentric training that's been so prevalent in the United States for so long, but also that Dr. Sue mentioned that it's also been prevalent in many other countries as well. And we see that definitely throughout Latin America, that the kind of training that exists today in many areas really starts with Europe, and starts, with things like Freud, and that people aren't even being exposed to or made aware of some of those other kind of cultural roots of our understanding about psychology. So I think, learning some, and there's been more published now about the history and the background that kind of shows more of this, but we don't always know it. It's not always recognized and valued in our training and these other ways. So that creates a lot of challenges for us. And we find ourselves today in this contemporary moment where we are facing some extreme hostile political situations, hostile rhetoric in our political arenas, in our newspapers, in our media. We are in a moment where state violence perpetuated by our police throughout the United States has really been laid bare through, the death of George Floyd, through the homicide of George Floyd, and so many others have been brought to light through the Black Lives Matter movement. These are things that many of us have known and experienced directly within our own communities as well for many generations. Also, what we have seen is some of the difficult things that have been brought to light with the kind of anti-immigrant policies that the United States has put into place since probably about the mid-'80s, and the enforcement of these policies, particularly against people from Latin American countries, and the acts that have been brought to light through some of the lawsuits against Border Patrol agents. And that we see for some of us, I live here in Tucson, Arizona. This is part of the border. Border Patrol is part of something that we see, on our streets on a regular basis. And so this has been very much part of daily existence for a long time, but even more intense as we've seen what's happened with the detention of children and the families that have been crossing, especially in the last probably about 10 years. And really, some of you may have seen some of the images of where the children have been housed. House is maybe even a polite word. I don't even know that it's that good of a situation. So that the divisiveness of the nation that we also see within our own families, and we see across the generations, and then all this in the midst of the COVID-19 global pandemic that has disproportionately affected our communities with tremendous grief and loss for so many, has just been a real challenge of the moment. I think for all of us as individuals, for our communities, for our association, for sure. I would say things for us have been pretty rocky in the last year, trying to figure out how to keep going, how to stay resilient when we can't even see each other or give each other a hug, and trying to navigate things like the challenges of Zoom and remote teaching or remote connecting with committees. So I'll leave that there as maybe a bridge for our next section that we're going to talk about.
That's an excellent segue. Thank you. You're making my job easy. So how have you all managed it? What kinds of things have your associations been doing to kind of continue to maintain solidarity, to build resilience, to kind of keep growing, keep kind of pushing back the forces that oppress. Iva, do you want to begin that?
My traveling mouse goes in any direction it pleases. So I think that we have several different things that we are doing. One is that, as I said in the introduction, that we're taking on the issues of sorting people into different camps and directly in with what is known as a good relative initiative, and trying to hear from all of our members that want to participate about how they have felt unsupported within our organization, and to really process that. And our focus is on relationship. It is, it's not a quick fix. It's not a Band-Aid. It is talking about that deeper relationship that we have. We have circles of support that go on weekly since the pandemic started. And these range from having a themed presentation to song, prayer. It actually has ended up being in some times a book exchange of like resources. And so we are trying to support one another in this kind of informal embrace. And the students have an additional student only kind of group, which I think is very important for them. We have issued our statements of solidarity, for example, with the Black Lives Matter, and signing on to other in support of other groups in the awful kinds of discrimination that we continue to face. This, I'd like to go back to this on the impact of the racism and discrimination. We have that daily bombardment, and we aren't atypical at all. We have the daily bombardment of hurts and losses and deaths. And I think our social media in this time of isolation has really increased that exposure, and in really helping people learn to disconnect in order to really connect with one another. And and this is probably a very well-known term, the MMIW is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And this is morphed into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And then we have our Two-Spirit community, our males. And so it's now morphed into the Missing and Murdered Indigenous People. And this is an ongoing tremendous concern in our Native communities, because there's such a maze of networks of trying to get something tracked or trying to get some sort of law enforcement intervention. So we have a lot of unresolved kinds of violence in our Native communities, on top of that kind of discrimination that so many people of color have to deal with on a very regular basis, in whether that's lodging, whether that's getting served in a restaurant. One of my little sisters was up in Canada, and when she was just a young woman, and they told her, "We don't serve your kind in here." She wears her color, where I am white appearing. And those kinds of hurts are very deep for us. Not being allowed to use our traditional dress or any kind of regalia in graduation, or even attending school events. Being criticized for having long hair for some of our males that is traditional. So that's why I put into the Ethiopia put together the Warrior Scholars. That's why I put in there the documentary Real Indian, because so many people learn about what is an Indian from the media. And it's important for us to see how we've been presented in the media since the beginning of film. And so that's one that even some of our own people don't recognize that. And so that's out there. This, we also have this other, and I think this is probably true in other communities, but we have service providers like electricians, plumbers, that kind of thing, that won't come out to deliver any kind of services to the reservation. And so we're cut off from even having those supports that are available in many other communities. And so it is like that, you get that sense of there's no time to catch your breath. And so our organization is working at giving people permission to breathe deeply. And we have an art and healing project that was initiated by a member. We had a virtual solidarity run, which I thought was really cool. So but these are important. And one of our strongest ones that I think all of our organizations could benefit from is the strong mentoring. And Dr. Denise Newman has done an exceptional job of strengthening the mentoring program within the Society of Indian Psychologists. And this is really important. Another thing in process that I think is another one that for us, because we have so many impoverished communities, is giving psychology away. And this is an initiative by Dr. Joseph Gahn, who's our incoming president, that I did a presentation for New York University, and I said, we use the Indian copyright. And I got a message back. I never thought twice about it. I got a message back and they said, I've been researching that and I can't find the Indian copyright. And I said, I'm sorry, I should have explained. Indian copyright is that we share information, and if it's to benefit the people, if it's to help the people, use it, share it. It's meant to be out there. But if it's to profit you individually, that's a no-no. That is the Indian copyright that many of us go by. And that's how we're trying to get out the truth of our own history, because our history books are not doing us any favors. So we also have what most organizations have with the listservs to share information and opportunities. And we really are trying, because we're such a small group, we're trying to really support people, our members, that we're stretched very thin because there's so few of us, but we're supporting them to get involved in APA governance and the governance of other similar kinds of organizations, because we need the voices there. And we have publications like the Journal of Indigenous Research. We have the commentary on the APA Code of Ethics. This is one that Lighting the Path to Psychology Licensure that recently came out to help our young people, or our people that are trying to get licensed, to give them support, because it's a very challenging process. Many of us are first generation and haven't had anyone to guide us through. And it makes my heart sing to see the young people coming forward, and trying to figure out how can we best support them is one of our major goals. So I know there are lots of good ideas, so I'm going to hush up and pass the mic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very inspirational. Great work. Helen.
SIP is small, but very mighty. I mean, absolutely valuable. I would say some examples of how do we foster our own resilience, and right, and it's very community based. I mean, one of the issues we've always talked about is, as the most really unhealthy about Western psychology, is that focus on individualism when everything is systemic. But that also, while struggles being systemic is very difficult, that also means healing can be in community, which is very helpful. So mentoring is a huge part of what we do. We've had to move to virtual mentoring hours, of course, in this time. I was chair of APA Minority Fellowship Program, and it's painful that in this year still we're having psychologists in training, like in very isolated places that are non-diverse, calling and just in tears because they're just being told their research isn't valuable. Nobody cares about this community. Well, just because you don't know about it doesn't mean it's important. Or actually being harassed in very specific ways. So navigating these things, understand our place. As many of my colleagues have alluded to, this is within our own community, that one of the things that's becoming very clear as we're dealing with all this hate and harassment is who actually has expertise in this, who actually has data, and that many Asian Americans, especially US born, don't even have their own sense of Asian American history or identity. There are reasons we aren't taught, well, any of the EMPA history, but Asian American history, although we've been here for so long, if you really start to teach it, it becomes a story of colonialism and imperialism, and it's very unpleasant and illegal internment. But psychologically, even for a lot of our students and in our communities, then there is this sort of identity issue of where do I belong? Who am I trying to be? Not knowing the strengths that we do have about ways to heal and ways to build. One of the things that's been helpful about APA is definitely our alliances with our other EMPA organizations, actually creating work together, sharing resources. My involvement with that initially was talking about the ethics code and where we all found that it was really lacking in serving the needs of our communities. Since then, creating the Color of Justice Research Project, currently being involved in nationwide COVID research targeting the needs of our smallest communities, and being a part of the National Council of Asian Pacific Associations. So this is a 36 agency org based in DC, right? Really understanding that systemic change requires civic and policy data informed. So how do we make that connection between all this great scholarship, but how are we using it to sort of be available? And so that's where I think our young generation and their social media savvy is like very useful. Right, immediately creating things on Instagram to respond to how do we support people who are being affected by the COVID rise in India? How do we, share information about various topics? So making this research relevant to the community and useful, but also in the long run, needing to literally be at that table with policy and creating things there. And so growing into that way, as we have been doing as well. Several of us are also involved with like a large scale sort of Facebook project. So again, knowing that there are untraditional ways that we have to find to reach our community, to share what is the best we can do with our sort of integrated psychologies.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Ethiopia.
Thank you, Fred. As I reflect on this piece, I'm also listening to my colleagues, and I'm trusting that the audience can hear the themes emerging among us. First and foremost, this idea of, in order to be woke, to really know who we are from an ethnically centered place, we have to do what every other psychologist is expected to do, and then more. So that's part of that exhaustion that structural racism can place upon ethnic communities, is I have to get what I need to get the degree and to be licensed, but to really understand who I am and how best to use my talents in my people's community, I have to go study deeper again, above and beyond. So I just want to kind of underscore that among all of us, and that work, that lifting that we're doing too, can be exhaustion and is another result of structural racism. And I also reflected on many times people are embracing Martin Luther King's comments and hailing him. And I know APA has done that many times, and he came and spoke within APA, but I find it interesting that some of his comments are not what's being spoken. And one I wanted to bring forward is when he talked about racism, and his message clear to APA was, white America needs to understand that it is poisoned to its soul by racism. And the understanding needs to be carefully documented and consequently more difficult to reject. And for me, that kind of speaks to what we've been talking about here, is that the Western psychology comes from a poisonous well. It doesn't mean it's all poison, but it comes from a poisonous well because it stands on the back of this white supremacy ideology and capitalism that places one group above the other, or privileges one way of being over others. And one clear example among us as EMPAs is the overemphasis on the individual, when many of us, our psychology, our wellness, our wholeness centers in our collective. And you can see that coming through with some of the resources that the family has already spoken about. But it also speaks to the ways in which, particularly for Blacks, and this is internationally because this myth of white supremacy and the myth of Black inferiority is universal, just manifests itself differently based on the context. But the point I want to say too is it makes us not want to recognize ourselves. We hear a lot about the benefits of yoga, but no one's talking about the ethnic roots of yoga in Kemet. right? So it's like there's something about that makes it hard to appreciate what was born from Africa. I say that because that's a huge challenge for us. And it also guides us as we're trying to move forward and be resilient, which means we first have to name who we are, name what we're dealing with to help guide us, because otherwise we'll be stuck in being in reaction to, and that's not what ABSI is about. We are about illuminating and recognizing and birthing. So I want to give one other quote that I also think is quite relevant for all of the EMPAs, if you can sort of put in their particular group. So Asa Hilliard, one of our scholar warriors who's transitioned, said, there is something wrong with a psychology and psychological analysis that leaves African descent people strangers to themselves, aliens to their culture, oblivious to their condition, and less than human to their oppressor. And I would submit that's been our collective lived experience in this psychology as well as global, when we talked about how it gets imposed. So when we're trying to illuminate and bring these things forward, I'm extremely proud of the shift that ABSI has made in response to the intersectionality of the COVID and racial pandemics. And first and foremost, we've been dealing with pandemics seen and unseen for a very long time. But we pivoted quite nicely into the virtual space. And I love this phrase that Iva said about the Indian copyright, because it sits here too. It's always been our intention to give back to our people and to learn from them. And this shows up in a couple of ways. One is we do have the emotional emancipation circles that were designed at the request and in collaboration with the Community Healing Network. And this is a curricula that was actually born in around 2012 that's intended to help communities look at who they are as people of African ancestry, define how they want to be based on our 7 principles of Mayat. These were born from us and by us with no one's money, if you will. And we've gifted them all over the world because they're not predicated on having an expert run them. Instead, we're helping our communities do community again, to step back into the collective wisdom, looking out for one another, turning the situations that they're in, being more proactive and culturally clear about how to be in the world in terms of we are our own best medicine. So that's one thing that has just taken on a meaning in and of itself. It sort of almost reminds me of sort of the Underground Railroad, because we did not reach out to anyone to popularize it. It's just sort of word of mouth and boom, it's all over the world, right? And it's still being asked for, it's still under demand. In this time of where we are now in response to COVID, we've also launched the Sawubona Healing Circles, which are meant to be, I conceptualize them as sort of a rapid response to the immediate and acute crisis hitting our communities. We did not need to wait for someone statistically tell us that people of African ancestry will be hit hardest around the COVID. Soon as COVID hit, we went, okay, wait, what are we gonna do to help our people? Because we knew it. I come from this idea that community wisdom is essential before there is a professional science. And what I mean by that is, I remember being told many times, when white America catches a cold, we catch pneumonia. For me, that's now what healthcare people call healthcare disparities. We didn't need that scientific name. So we were prepared to launch these. We also utilized them during the time of the trial in response to the death of our dear brother. Just excuse me. Let me just breathe through this. Because even I get ready to say, there's so many names to be named, and we're tired of these names that need to be named. So I just want to say thank you to the Association of Black Psychologists, to my members who joined with me in creating these spaces in the way in which our communities have responded all over the world. We have been doing webinars that are posted on our Facebook, that are there recorded, and it's allowed us to do these webinars with our brothers and sisters from South Africa, from UK, from Canada. So where we had geographical limitations, we've now gone above and beyond and made the virtual space part of our healing process as well too. I also want to underscore the work that's being done, as Helen alluded to, with the needs assessment, where the Congressional Black Caucus approached us. And so through the Tri-Caucus, a number of the alliances came together to do a deep dive in looking at the impact of the COVID within our respective communities. And we just launched the initial findings from this first phase. And of course, it has implications for policymaking. It has implications for psychology and things of that nature too. So those are some of the things we do across the table as ethnic groups and then within our own spaces and places.
Thank you so much. You see how personal it is.
It is, it really is, it really is.
Andrea?
It's so easy to go after Ethiopia because she already, she laid all the groundwork. So I'm going to keep mine really brief because everyone, every one of my colleagues has already, given you so much of the reasons why. I think that resonates across all of our groups. So some of the things that we are doing, what I've seen as a real shift in NLPA is to acknowledge the structural racism and systemic oppression that exist. And in doing so, focusing more than ever on advocacy and quick responses to immediate political issues or political policy that's being put forward. I'll put a link in the chat when I'm done speaking where you can see the statements that we've made. We've been more active than ever and involved in pushing back, sharing our research, and trying to turn things around very quickly, which is something that is so essential to who we are, even though it creates additional stress and time pressure and is in addition to all the other work that we do. It's something that as an association, we have been so fully committed to and even push each other when we don't respond quick enough. So, and I think it's something that's gone beyond the boundaries of the initial mission of our work and also spread to the issues identified by the other associations here today. So that's something that I also appreciate, and many of our past presidents have been involved in this kind of alliance and connection and found, great strength from connecting with the other associations for a long time, but also that opportunity then to share with some authenticity the statements that are coming out or the research or the work that are coming out from the other psychological associations that you see represented here today. What we have, we've also been part of the COVID-19 research and also leading some of the research related to DACA. We've even taken that on as an association, which is a role we have not done before. That's mainly been left to our partners, but felt that that was an important piece for us to move forward as an association. The other one, and I think this has probably been the most challenging, is recentering ourselves and committing to continue learning within our group by identifying and listening to the voices that are the most marginalized, even within our organization. And that I think, is always a bit of a challenge. There's reasons why they've been marginalized for so long, and those go to historical roots that have been acknowledged here, not only in the United States, but in other countries, and the issues of colorism and racism and different castes and all that sort of thing. We've been working more and more to bring in speakers who can share some of that background and history and to talk about some of the current research. But it takes us, it's really that anti-racist work of being really intentional to say, we are going to change this and what really is going on. And we've been involved in some self-study now with a consulting group to really look at, what we've done and what we haven't done. And this is some really hard work to do, and it's brought to light some real serious tensions. And I think we're still working also to figure out, what are the changes that we need to do, and how do we get our whole association on board to really make it something really real and really sustainable. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Kisler.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I too need to thank the other folks on the panel for naming what a lot of us are going through, especially Dr. Jackson's point of, first we have to do all the things that everybody else does, and then there's additional work on top of it to know ourselves and how we place ourselves in the work. As for things that we're specifically doing as an organization, I think it's both a work of connecting and healing within our group, with one another, supporting one another, but then also educating and pushing for advocacy outside of the organization. So like others, we're actively producing relatively quick responding advocacy statements. And something that's really noteworthy there, I think, that's been alluded to before on the panel as well, is that the advocacy committee, when they submit things to me in draft form, they're so thankful for the opportunity to produce it every time. And it's always stressful and it's always draining. And yet the response of the group working on these statements is appreciation for the opportunity, because they find it healing to connect with others who are experiencing oppression in similar ways. The other things that we do, much like others too, is the various support circles and opportunities to connect with each other. Sometimes those support circles are organized by our practice committee, sometimes by student committee, and sometimes by the advocacy committee, especially too. We've been hosting some educational webinars that we hope others can attend. So for example, last year, again, our student committee, it's always our student committee, shout out to them. Student committee last summer organized a webinar on micro interventions designed to interrupt or disarm racial microaggressions. Let's see, what else have we been doing? Our student committee actually is going to be hosting a panel relatively similar to this one for student EMPA leaders. So all of our organizations are going to be represented on June 14th there as well, which I think is amazing considering how much we know that how powerful it is to connect with other individuals experiencing the challenges of progressing through an academic environment that is colonial and it kind of actively works against the way that they were brought up. So I'm sure I'm missing some things, but I'm aware of the time, so I don't want to take up too much of the time. I guess I'll also mention that we also have a mentorship program that's underway. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Okay, last thing. I'm really excited and I cannot wait as I witness our group growing, discovering and unlocking our cultural paradigms. I get emotional when I hear other folks talking about that. And I think it's challenging in part because even in our home countries, Western psychology has been predominant. So it really is a process of discovering and unlocking the more ancient wisdom that's there.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm overwhelmed. I'm kind of choked up myself about just the amount of sacrifice and the amount of work, because the volunteerism is in addition to your regular jobs and the amount of sacrifice you all do to be there for your students and to be there for your communities, in addition to family and work responsibilities. Is just, I mean, I'm there with you, but it just does me proud. I did want to speak to a couple of the questions. We only have a few minutes left. So one was, Helen, you already spoke to it, but I wanted to put it to the panel. So organizations such as APA have been criticized for their foundations, practices, regulations, procedures, which center and embrace Western white ideologies, yet EMPAs to some extent still operate under APA's umbrella. How can EMPAs truly then centralize their own marginalized communities and avoid repeating and practicing some of these Western white practices?
So I would love to go first, Fred, just to kind of clarify. So again, the Association of Black Psychologists does not work under APA at all. At all. We are completely independent. There are times when we choose to be part of, and one of the primary reasons for doing so is in solidarity to our other ethnic psychological associations. So we are not voting members of APA. We have no fiduciary or power commitment in any other kind of way. However, what I will say to the question is that we still sometimes have to struggle within ourselves the ways in which Western thought is still impacting us as we're trying to stay grounded in our African wisdom. So there's a quote that Dr. Wade Nobles would say, which is, we are African by nature and American by nurture. So that's our conflict, is how to continually recognize internalized racism, push it out, stay centered in our Blackness, and not perpetuate the mess through which we're trying to step away from.
I would add one other example that we are actually looking at right now, and that is when we became a nonprofit, you had to have bylaws. And essentially those were taken like from a template from another successful organization. And we had the big aha, this isn't working for us. We don't operate in this way. We do not have our council of elders clearly defined. And so on top of everything else, we're looking at redoing, indigenizing, decolonizing our bylaws to actually reflect the way that we approach our business, our problem solving, and this collectivistic society that many of us have been raised in is extremely important. We had the talk therapies for generations and generations, and in some of our communities, they were called clan aunties and clan uncles that would go to a person they saw in distress. And I have to say that the traditional way of describing mental disorders is heartwarming to me, because instead of a label, they would say things like, he doesn't know himself anymore. And we have a number of people on another level that do not know themselves. So I'm decolonizing. I'll hush.
I just say ditto to that, as well as a 501c3, the challenge of, again, how to work from even our own ethics in the midst of those types of constraints. I share that as well too. And I love this idea of how to decolonize our bylaws, which is what we're doing in terms of adopting a new system called CAICOs.
And that is one thing that some of our members did, was they created more detailed ethics for NLPA. And I think that's been really useful and shared quite a bit amongst our organization.